Hey there, it's Mrs. Sydell. I'm going to be reading 2 chapters of Stuart Little today, and the first chapter is called The Sailboat Race. When the people in Central Park learned that one of the toy sailboats was being steered by a mouse in a sailor suit, they all came running. Soon the shores of the pond were so crowded that a policeman was sent from headquarters to announce that everybody would have to stop pushing, but nobody did. People in New York liked to push each other. The most excited person of all was the boy who owned the Lillian B. Womrath. He was a fat, sulky boy of 12. His name was Leroy. He wore a blue serge suit and a white necktie stained with orange juice. "Come back here," he called to Stuart. "Come back here and get on my boat. I want you to steer my boat. I'll pay you $5 a week, and you can have every Thursday afternoon off and a radio in your room." "I thank you for your kind offer," replied Stuart, "but I'm happy aboard the Wasp, happier than I've ever been in my whole life." And with that, he spun the wheel over smartly and headed his schooner down toward the starting line, where Leroy was turning his boat around by poking it with a long stick, ready for the start of the race. "I'll be the referee," said a man in a bright green suit. "Is the Wasp ready?" "Ready, sir," shouted Stuart, touching his hat. "Is the Lillian B. Womrath ready?" asked the referee. "Sure, I'm ready," said Leroy. "To the north end of the pond and back again," shouted the referee. "On your mark, get set, go!" "Go!" cried the people along the shore. "Go!" cried the owner of the Wasp. "Go!" yelled the policeman. And away went the 2 boats for the north end of the pond. While the seagulls wailed and cried overhead, and the taxicabs tooted and honked from 72nd Street, and the west wind sang and whistled in the rigging and blew spray across the decks, stinging Stuart's cheeks with tiny fragments of flying peanut shell tossed up from the foamy deep. "This is the life for me!" Stuart murmured to himself. "What a ship! What a day! What a race!" Before the 2 boats had gone many feet, however, an accident happened on shore. The people were pushing each other harder and harder in their eagerness to see the sport, and although they really didn't mean to, they pushed the policeman so hard they pushed him right off the concrete wall and into the pond. He hit the water in a sitting position and got wet clear up to the 3rd button of his jacket. He was soaked. This particular policeman was not only a big, heavy man, but he had just eaten a big, heavy meal, and the wave he made went curling outward, cresting and billowing, upsetting all manner of small craft, and causing every owner of a boat on the pond to scream with delight and consternation. When Stuart saw the great wave approaching, he jumped for the rigging, but he was too late. Towering above the Wasp like a mountain, the wave came crashing and piling along the deck, caught Stuart up and swept him over the side and into the water, where everybody supposed he would drown. Stuart had no intention of drowning. He kicked hard with his feet, and he thrashed hard with his tail, and in a minute or 2 he climbed back aboard the schooner, cold and wet, but quite unharmed. As he took his place at the helm, he could hear people cheering for him and calling, "Atta mouse, Stuart! Atta mouse!" He looked over and saw that the wave had capsized the Lillian B. Womrath, but she had righted herself and was sailing on her course close by. And she stayed close alongside till both boats reached the north end of the pond. Here, Stuart put the Wasp about, and Leroy turned the Lillian around with his stick, and away the 2 boats went for the finish line. "This race isn't over yet," thought Stuart. The first warning he had that there was trouble ahead came when he glanced into the Wasp's cabin and observed that the barometer had fallen sharply. That can mean only one thing at sea: bad weather. Suddenly a dark cloud swept across the sun, blotting it out and leaving the earth in shadow. Stuart shivered in his wet clothes. He turned up his sailor blouse closer around his neck, and when he spied the Wasp's owner among the crowd on shore, he waved his hat and called out, "Bad weather ahead, sir! Wind backing into the southwest! Seas confused! Glass falling!" "Never mind the weather," cried the owner. "Watch out for the flotsam dead ahead!" "Watch out for the flotsam dead ahead!" Stuart peered ahead into the gathering storm, but he saw nothing except gray waves with white-blue crests. The world seemed cold and ominous. Stuart glanced behind him. There came the sloop, boiling along fast, rolling up a bow wave and gaining steadily. "Look out, Stuart! Look out where you're going!" Stuart strained his eyes, and suddenly, dead ahead, right in the path of the Wasp, he saw an enormous paper bag looming up on the surface of the pond. The bag was empty and riding high, its open end gaping wide like the mouth of a cave. Stuart spun the wheel over, but it was a bit too late. The Wasp drove her bowsprit straight into the bag, and with a fearful whoosh the schooner slowed down and came up into the wind with all sails flapping. Just at this moment, Stuart heard a splintering crash, saw the bow of the Lilian plow through his rigging, and felt the whole ship tremble from stern to stern with the force of the collision. "A collision!" shouted the crowd on shore. In a jiffy, the two boats were in a terrible tangle. Little boys on shore screamed and danced up and down. Meanwhile, the paper bag sprang a leak and began to fill. The Wasp couldn't move because of the bag. The Lilian B. Womrath couldn't move because her nose was stuck in the Wasp's rigging. Waving his arms, Stuart ran forward and fired off his gun. Then he heard, above the other voices on shore, the voice of the owner of the Wasp yelling directions and telling him what to do. "Stuart! Stuart! Down jib! Down staysail!" Stuart jumped for the halyards, and the jib and the forestaysail came rippling down. "Cut away all paper bags!" roared the owner. Stuart whipped out his pocket knife and he slashed away bravely at the soggy bag until the deckhead cleared. "Now back your foresail and give her a full!" screamed the owner of the Wasp. Stuart grabbed the foresail boom and pulled with all his might. Slowly the schooner paid off and began to gather headway. As she heeled over to the breeze, she rolled her rail out from under the Lilian's nose, shook herself free, and stood away to the southward. A loud cheer went up from the bank. Stuart sprang to the wheel and answered it. Then he looked back, and to his great joy he perceived that the Lilian had gone off in a wild direction and was yarring all over the pond. Straight and true sailed the Wasp, with Stuart at the helm. After she had crossed the finish line, Stuart brought her alongside the wall and was taken ashore and highly praised for his fine seamanship and daring. The owner was delighted and said it was the happiest day of his life. He introduced himself to Stuart, said that in private life he was Dr. Paul Carey, a surgeon dentist. He said model boats were his hobby and that he would be delighted to have Stuart take command of his vessel at any time. Everybody shook hands with Stuart. Everybody, that is, except the policeman, who was too wet and mad to shake hands with a mouse. When Stuart got home that night, his brother George asked him where he had been all day. "Oh, knocking around town," replied Stuart. Chapter 8. Margalo. Because he was so small, Stuart was often hard to find around the house. His father and his mother and his brother George seldom could locate him by looking for him. Usually they had to call him, and the house often echoed with cries of "Stuart! Stuart! 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 Stuart!" You would come into a room, and he might be curled up in a chair, but you wouldn't see him. Mr. Little was in constant fear of losing him and never finding him again. He even made him a tiny red cap, such as hunters wear, so that he could be easier to see. One day, when he was 7 years old, Stuart was in the kitchen watching his mother make tapioca pudding. He was feeling hungry, and when Mrs. Little opened the door of the electric refrigerator to get something, Stuart slipped inside to see if he could find a piece of cheese. He supposed, of course, his mother had seen him, and when the door swung shut and he realized he was locked in, it surprised him greatly. "Help!" he called. "It's dark in here! It's cold in this refrigerator! Help! Let me out! I'm getting colder by the minute!" but his voice was not strong enough to penetrate the thick wall. In the darkness, he stumbled and fell into a saucer of prunes. The juice was cold. Stuart shivered, and his teeth chattered. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mrs. Little again opened the door and found him standing on a butter plate, beating his arms together to try to keep warm. He was blowing on his hands and hopping up and down. "Oh, mercy," she cried. "Stuart, my poor little baby." "I'm chilled to the bone," said Stuart, but his mother made him some hot broth and put him to bed in his little box, with a doll's hot water bottle against his feet. Even so, Stuart caught a bad cold, and this turned into bronchitis, and Stuart had to stay in bed for almost 2 weeks. During his illness, the other members of the family were extremely kind to Stuart. Mrs. Little played tic-tac-toe with him. George made him a soap bubble pipe and a bow and arrow. Mr. Little made him a pair of ice skates out of 2 paper clips. One cold afternoon, Mrs. Little was shaking her dust cloth out the window when she noticed a small bird lying on the windowsill. Looked like he was dead. She brought it in and put it near the heater, and in a short while it fluttered its wings and opened its eyes. It was a pretty little hen bird, brown with a streak of yellow. The Littles didn't agree on what kind of bird she was. "She's a wall-eyed vireo," said George scientifically. "I think she's more like a young wren," said Mr. Little. Anyway, they fixed a place for her in the living room and fed her and gave her a cup of water. Soon she felt much better and went hopping around the house, examining everything with the greatest care and interest. Presently she hopped upstairs and into Stuart's room where he was lying in bed. "Hello," said Stuart. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" "My name is Margalo," said the bird, soft. "I come from fields once tall with wheat, from pastures deep in fern and thistle. I come from vales of meadows sweet, and I love to whistle." Stuart sat upright in bed. "Say that again," he said. "I can't," said Margalo. "I have a sore throat." "So have I," said Stuart. "I've got bronchitis. You better not get too near me. You might catch it." "I'll stay right by the door," said Margalo. "You can use some of my gargle if you want to," said Stuart. "And here are some nose drops, and I have plenty of Kleenex." "Thank you very much. You're very kind," replied the bird. "Did they take your temperature?" asked Stuart, who was beginning to be genuinely worried about his new friend's health. "No," said Margalo, "but I don't think it will be necessary." "Well, we better make sure," said Stuart, "because I would hate to have anything happen to you. Here." And he tossed her the thermometer. Margalo put it under her tongue, and she and Stuart sat very still for 3 minutes. Then she took it out and looked at it, turning it slowly and carefully. "Normal," she announced. Stuart felt his heart leap for gladness. It seemed to him that he had never seen any creature so beautiful as this tiny bird, and already he loved her. "I hope," he remarked, "that my parents have fixed you up with a decent place to sleep." "Oh, yes," Margalo replied. "I'm going to sleep in the Boston fern on the bookshelf in the living room. It's a nice place for a city location. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think I shall go to bed. I see it's getting dark outside, and I always go to bed at sundown. Good night, sir." "Please don't call me sir," said Stuart. "Call me Stuart." "Very well," said the bird. "Good night, Stuart." And she hopped off with light bouncing steps. "Good night, Margalo," called Stuart. "See you in the morning." Stuart settled back under the bedclothes again. "There's a mighty fine bird," he whispered, and he sighed a tender sigh. When Mrs. Little came in later to tuck Stuart in for the night and hear his prayers, Stuart asked her if she thought the bird would be quite safe sleeping down in the living room. "Quite safe, my dear," replied Mrs. Little. "What about the cat, Snowbell?" asked Stuart sternly. "Snowbell won't touch the bird," his mother said. "You go to sleep and forget all about it." Mrs. Little opened the window and turned out the light. Stuart closed his eyes and lay there in the dark, but he couldn't seem to go to sleep. He tossed and he turned, and the bedclothes got all rumpled up. He kept thinking about the bird downstairs asleep in the fern. He kept thinking about Snowbell, and about the way Snowbell's eyes gleamed. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he switched on the light. "There's just something in me that doesn't trust a cat," he muttered. "I can't sleep knowing that Margalo is in danger." Pushing the covers back, Stuart climbed out of bed. He put on his wrapper and slippers. Taking his bow and arrow and his flashlight, he tiptoed out into the hall. Everybody had gone to the bed, and the house was dark. Stuart found his way to the stairs and descended slowly and cautiously into the living room, making no noise. His throat hurt, and he felt dizzy. "As sick as I am," he said to himself, "this has got to be done." Being careful not to make a sound, he stole across to the lamp by the bookshelf, shimmied up the cord, and climbed out onto the shelf. There was a faint ray of light from the street lamp outside, and Stuart could dimly see Margalo, asleep in the fern, her head tucked under her wing. "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast," he whispered, repeating a speech that he had heard in the movies. Then he hid behind a candlestick and waited, listening and watching. For half an hour he saw nothing, heard nothing but the faint ruffle of Margalo's wings when she stirred in her dream. The clock struck 10 loudly, and before the sound of the last stroke had died away, Stuart saw 2 gleaming yellow eyes peering out behind the sofa. "So," thought Stuart, "I guess there's going to be something doing after all." He reached for his bow and arrow. The eyes came nearer. Stuart was frightened, but he was a brave mouse, and even when he had a sore throat, he placed the arrow against the cord of the bow and waited. Snowbell crept softly toward the bookshelf and climbed noisily up the chair within reach of the Boston fern where Margalo was asleep. And then he crouched, ready to spring. His tail waved back and forth. His eyes gleamed bright. Stuart decided the time had come. He stepped out from behind the candlestick, knelt down, bent his bow, and took careful aim at Snowbell's left ear, which was closest to him. "This is the finest thing I have ever done," thought Stuart, and he shot the arrow right into the cat's ear. Snowbell squealed with pain and jumped down and ran off toward the kitchen. "A direct hit," said Stuart. "Thank heaven. Well, there's a good night's work done." And he threw a kiss toward Margalo's sleeping form. It was a tired little mouse that crawled into bed a few minutes later, tired but ready for sleep at last.